Okay, so we're going to be continuing period 8 now. We're in the post-war period, and we're talking about culture and conformity and consumerism in the 1950s, and then we'll get a little bit into the beginnings of the civil rights movement. So a few things that I want to draw on from the previous days of notes to keep in mind when you're thinking about like 1950s culture is the baby boom and the suburbs, right? Those are two really big things. And I guess a third would be the Red Scare and all of this communism and stuff, because like I said, in I think the last video, a lot of the like cultural changes we're going to see are going to really be like pushback from communism, trying to separate ourselves. So because of this baby boom and all of our cultural, or all of our growing families and these moves to the suburbs that we're seeing take place, I mentioned that we're seeing new businesses grow. Especially out in suburban locations. So like fast food places, drive-ins, drive-throughs, shopping malls. And that's really going to start to fuel a culture of consumerism. There's so many new types of business, and we're living in a time of a lot of economic prosperity, so people feel comfortable not just raising a family but like spending money on luxury goods and products. So we're going to see a lot of consumerism, and that's really going to be reinforced by television, the media. One thing that a common theme we're going to see over and over in period 8 is the way that the media and television is not only going to affect our culture, but our politics, our economics, everything. It's definitely going to be one of the biggest inventions with sweeping repercussions in every category of American life. Television isn't just going to reinforce all those like consumerist ideas, like we're going to see, television commercials, but we're going to see, those traditional conservative sides of our culture that we're experiencing because we're trying to be the opposite of communism, right? We're trying to hold fast to Christianity and traditional moral values. We're going to see that also reflected in our television and in our programming. We're going to see the birth of basically the sitcom. They didn't call them sitcoms then. That term isn't going to start to be more popular until probably closer to like the 70s and 80s. But in reality, a lot of these shows were sitcoms, which just means a situational comedy. So you don't have to have seen every episode, to understand what's going on. Like you can't just like pick up the 10th episode of Game of Thrones and follow, but you can watch the like 300th episode of Leave It to Beaver and understand exactly what's going on. And a lot of these television shows are going to reinforce all of those values. We're going to see the I guess you would say like the glorification of the nuclear family. The nuclear family is the traditional family structure with heterosexual mom and dad married, living in the home with the children. That's the traditional family structure, and that's called the nuclear family. So of course every family depicted in television in the 1950s and even into the 60s is going to fit that nuclear family structure. Popular shows that are easy to look back and see that reflected in Leave It to Beaver is one that I love to point at, and a good example. If we were in class, we would watch an episode or two. You can find some online, but it's basically about this family, the Cleaver family, and they are all of the most perfect, wonderful stereotypes of our good white American Christian family on TV. It's mom and dad, Ward and June Cleaver, and they live in the suburbs, and dad works in the city, how most fathers do, where you never see him pretty much like not in a suit on the way to work or at home in a button up and a cardigan. That's his relaxed outfit. And June, the wife, she's obviously a stay-at-home mom, and she is involved in charities and clubs and stuff around her community, and she's always dressed perfectly. You never see June June not looking a 10, you know, heels, earrings, pearls, the whole nine, whether she's washing dishes, gardening, it doesn't matter. June always looks perfect. So we're definitely seeing like the standards of what we expect our women to look like and the standards that we expect our men to be holding to, financially speaking, reflected in this. And then there are two boys. Wally is the oldest one, and he's like, you know, dumb teenager, jock guy, you know, leather jacket type of dude. And then the show centers around the youngest son. What I think his real name in the show is Theodore, maybe, but they call him Beaver Cleaver, and that's why the show is called Beaver to Lever. That's not a thing. Leave It to Beaver. But it's just about, you know, their family like Beaver getting into like nonsense and stuff. But you always see those traditional nuclear family values presented in the show. There's always, you know, any type of conflict is typically like a minimal one. There's never any depiction of like true life hardships like poverty or discrimination or racism. There's like one episode where their gardener is an alcoholic, and it basically all gets solved in like rainbows and sunshine at the end or something. That's like the closest thing to like a real life problem that you ever see in the show. And there are pretty much no you know, characters of color. I haven't seen every episode, but of what I have seen, I don't remember ever seeing anyone on the entire show that wasn't white. So I'm sure there's some minor character in one episode that might be a person of color, but nothing I can think of off the top of my head. So, you know, that traditional family structure that we're seeing from this baby boom, like I said, we're seeing it in our television. So, and people watch this, television is more popular than ever, and they think, well, that's what my family's supposed to be like. And that's where a lot of that like pressure to conform comes from. If your family doesn't look like this, if you are not that wife, if you are not that father, then you're doing something wrong. And a lot of people feel pressured to give into this, which is why we see a lot of those beatniks, people like Betty Friedan, when she published The Feminine Mystique, that the June Cleavers of the world, that was exactly who she was talking about. The problem she discusses in her book is the problem that has no name. And what she's talking about is women, the psychological effects on women who are, you know, pressured from society and raised to believe that their only job is to be a wife and a mother. So like women who are, you know, they go to college, but you're not encouraged to go to college to like find your interests and you know, develop a career and pursue your dreams. You're told to go to college so that you can meet a man. And when you meet a man, you drop out of college and you get married and you move to the suburbs and you have a baby. And the process sort of begins all over again, sort of like the Little Boxes song, right? So, Leave It to Beaver, like I said, is a good example. There are others. Father Knows Best is one. There are a bunch. And so we've got a lot of conversations about how you should raise your children. Is this you know, what environment should your children be raised in? And definitely the most popular, scientist and doctor to speak on the matter was a guy named Dr. Spock, S-P-O-C-K. No, it has nothing to do with Star Trek, different Spock. But Dr. Spock published a book called The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. And essentially what he was talking about in the book is you can't love your kids too much. You can never nurture your kids too much. You should always, you know, shower your children with love and all sorts of stuff like that. So and that's definitely not the like traditional way of raising your children. Before, you know, there wasn't a lot of focus on, I guess you would say, like supporting emotions in previous generations of their culture. So that's definitely a new thing. And Dr. Spock was all the rage. All the moms wanted to, you know, do whatever Dr. Spock said and follow all of his rules. Now, like I said, there's going to be plenty of pushback and shake up to some of that traditional culture. Like we already talked about the beatniks and writers like that, but we're going to see it in art. We're going to see it in music. We're going to see it all over the place. And rock and roll music is definitely one of the biggest areas that we're going to see it in, as this is going to, instead of become like a subculture of music, it's quickly going to become like mainstream music. So rock and roll culture, really comes from African Americans. Rock and roll gets its roots in rhythm and blues, which gets its roots in like Southern gospel, which goes back to like slave spirituals. So like a lot of this traces down to like Southern African American composed music. That's where a lot of the traditions of rock and roll music come from. And because of that, rock and roll is really sort of like rhythm and blues and country had a baby. That's kind of what rock was in the 1950s. I don't want to say is now because it's obviously evolved. But people called rock and roll, before they used that phrase, they called it race music because it was considered to be music that was one, composed and performed by Black people, and two, racy music. When you talk about something being racy, you know, it's like kind of scandalous. So the term is twofold. And so because of that, a lot of people just would refuse to listen to it. They would just be like, oh, absolutely, we're not going to listen to this race music. I'm sure I can hear my like 89-year-old grandmother saying that now. And it was very racially mixed. A lot of rock and roll artists, you know, composed, whether it was a Black or a white composer, but they played in integrated bands a lot of the time, which was obviously very not mainstream. So there was a DJ in the Midwest named Alan Freed, Freed. There's a very good drunk history on him. If you have Hulu, text me and I'll tell you what episode it is. But Alan Freed, he listened to this music at a huge radio show, like millions of listeners, and wanted to play some of this music. But obviously he can't play it and call it race music because people are going to turn it off, not listen to him, and it could tank his career. So instead, he has to give it a new name, and the name he gives it is rock and roll. So he would talk about, you know, his whole show was crazy. He would like make all these crazy sounds, and he would talk so differently from other radio hosts and like use different inflections in his voice, like keep you entertained, and he'd try to make his show like super exciting. And he would play what he called rock and roll music, and it was this quote unquote race music that people had been listening to, but the younger generation who hadn't necessarily had all those you know, I guess stereotypes and biases and prejudices put into their brains 100% yet loved this music because it was catchy. And so Alan Freed ended up organizing like concerts to feature rock and roll bands, and riots would break out at them because the congregation that had formed to listen to the music or had come to see the concert was a biracial one. There were people who were white and Black dancing together. Can you imagine the scandal of it all? But he ended up getting fired from his radio show, but it's not like he didn't have a incredibly lasting impact, and he'll end up doing other things later on. But that just kicks off this wave of rock and roll music. Definitely the most famous rock and roll artist to come out of the 1950s is Elvis Presley, and he is the perfect example of the controversy of rock and roll and also the roots of rock and roll. Really, Elvis, you know, if you don't know anything about Elvis, he grew up in Memphis, which was obviously segregated during his young years. And a lot of the music that he listened to growing up was rhythm and blues music by Black artists and like Southern country gospel music in Black and white churches. And if you know a lot about those different types of genres, then you can hear a lot of it in his music. But his first single was Heartbreak Hotel, and it went #1 very quickly. He was brought onto the Ed Sullivan Show, which is sort of like, you know, like a Jimmy Fallon or a James Corden show, and asked to perform, but they wouldn't film him from the waist down. If you see that picture right there, the crazy like stance that he has, the way that he would dance, you could, you know, look up on YouTube videos of Elvis dancing. He would, you know, gyrate his hips a lot, and that was super scandalous. This man like thrusting his pelvis around on television was absolutely not appropriate. So they would not film his waist down, and so he ended up being even more popular because of that, because people were like, oh, well, if they're not going to show it on TV, I want to see it in person. So that almost made him even more famous, and he'll end up, you know, sort of steering that career into movies and continue music and all sorts of other stuff. So, like I said, we're seeing the blending of cultures in the sort of backlash, and television is showcasing every version of that, right? You're seeing the conformist side in TV shows like Leave It to Beaver, and you're also seeing the pushback when you turn on the Ed Sullivan Show and you see brand new music from people like Elvis Presley. So television is also going to be a way to help the civil rights movement gain a lot of traction here. When we think about the civil rights movement, this is the time period we think about, but this isn't necessarily when the movement started. It actually started when the NAACP was founded, which was, like 30 to 40 years before any of this. But anytime we saw, I guess, protests and campaigns like the Double V campaign or things like that, and the Niagara movement, it was sort of like one thing at a time. A lot wasn't happening. And really the only people who would hear about those protests were the people that lived in that community. If there was a protest about segregation in your town, you would hear about it, but you're not going to hear about what's happening, even in the next town, much less 7 states away, much less in an entire region of the country you don't even live in. And we're seeing all these people start to move to the Sun Belt, more of every color of people moving into the Sun Belt. And that will, as populations increase, tensions always increase. And now that we have television to sort of put all of this on blast for the world to see, it's really going to give the civil rights movement a platform it didn't have before. Now, I'll sort of go in, I guess, chronological order here, and sort of in some early events of the civil rights movement all through the 1950s. Really, even before the 1950s, we did see some improvement. We talked about during World War II when we saw the Double V campaign, and after World War II in 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981 desegregating our military. So by the time our military was fighting in Korea or Vietnam or any other future conflict, we're going to have an integrated military, which is definitely a good one. But the thing that's going to kick off this new wave of change is going to be a Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. This was in Topeka, Kansas, revolving around a little girl named Linda Brown, and several other cases all lumped together, but hers was the first listed. And the Supreme Court decided in her case that she would need to be allowed to go to a white school, and she was a black girl. So this case desegregated all public schools in the United States of every age range. And the Supreme Court said a very important thing in that decision, which was that separate is not equal. So they're overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. And then they say, number 2, that all schools need to integrate with all deliberate speed, which means right now, immediately, we're doing this, as soon as we can, not a 20-year plan, but right now, as in next year, we want you to be, come up with how you're going to integrate your schools. So they're basically just telling the South, we're overhauling this. You guys need to do this right now because you haven't done it before. And that's going to lead to a lot of pushback. Southern congressmen coming out and talking about over my dead body. The KKK is going to come back again. Other groups aside from KKK, one that was definitely more popular is called the White Citizens Council, which was basically I don't want to say the bougie clan, but that's kind of what it is. They don't wear hoods. And they don't burn people's houses down, but they are an organized group of racist people trying to stop the civil rights movement and integration. If you've seen the movie The Help, when Bryce Dallas Howard, the redheaded one, when she says to her maid, be careful, there are some real racists in this town, you laugh because you're like, oh my God, girl, you're a racist. How can you even say that? She's the exact type of person that would have been in the White Citizens Council. So like I said, we're going to see lots of backlash to that Supreme Court case. And it's going to put a new spotlight on the South. People are going to start looking and paying attention. And it's not just going to be oh, I'm tuning in to hear what's going on in the South. No, I can turn on my TV and see an interview with a person who was attacked by a Klansman. Or I can watch Strom Thurmond give a speech about how over his dead body will he allow the white race to be, I don't know, ruined by all of this, blah, 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 blah. So you can see all this stuff happening firsthand when before before, if you lived in other parts of the country, it was easy to have this perspective of like, hear no evil, see no evil. But now you can hear it and see it on your television every night, and that's hard to deny and hard to turn away from. So we'll start to see some things that gain, moments that gain a lot of media attention, and it inspires other activists across the South to push for change in their area, and those things get media attention, and it just becomes this wave of protest after protest. Now, there are a lot of problems in the South, race related, especially in the 1950s, and there are a lot of things that need to be solved, but segregation is obviously at the top of the list. So that's going to sort of be like the first I guess you would say, goal of the movement as they move forward. And an event that's going to show everyone the impact of segregation in terms of violence is the lynching, the murder of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy who was staying in Money, Mississippi. He was from Chicago. He went down to Mississippi to stay with some family. He said something to a white woman on his way out of a store. We found out, on her deathbed that she made up what he said. We do know he said something because of friends and cousins of his who were there at the time. But basically what he said was something, along the lines of, bye, baby. Nothing worse than that. But it was sort of a dare because he had told his friends that he had a white girlfriend back in Chicago, and, black teenagers in Mississippi, you telling them that you have a white girlfriend is unbelievable. So they were like, go say something to that white woman if you're not scared. And he was like, yeah, I'm not scared. And that's what happened. Well, that night, her husband and brother-in-law showed up at the home where Emmett Till was staying, and kidnapped him and drove him out into the middle of the woods and murdered him. He was shot and killed, brutally beaten. His body was tied to a cotton gin fan and then dunked in the river. And so he had gone missing. Of course, his mother had come down from Chicago to help try to look for him, Mammy Till, and he wasn't found, I think for several days. When they did find him, it was obvious what had happened to him. The police did an investigation, and they really mostly because of the press, and the press came because of a choice that Emmett Till's mother made when they had his funeral in Chicago, which was to have an open casket funeral because she wanted the world to see what those men had done to her son. And so Jet magazine, which was a black published magazine, published the photograph of Emmett Till in his casket, and that showed in their magazine, and it made national headlines all over the place. I am going to show you the picture. Trigger warning, here it comes. So this is Emmett Till alive and well on the left, and then the photograph on the right is him in his casket at his funeral. So shortly after his funeral, there was a lot of calls for an investigation. They do an investigation. They arrest these two guys. All white jury, white judge, all male jury, I should also add. And of course, they were found not guilty. The whole trial was an absolute joke and a sham, and it really just showed people who didn't live in the South the long effects that segregation have, that there's no true justice in a segregated society. So that's going to start to inspire more and more protests as time goes on. That same year, Emmett Till was killed earlier in the year, but in December of 1955 is when the Montgomery bus boycott will begin. It began around the same time that Emmett Till was killed, the arrest of a 16-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, who was friends with and involved in the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. They decided that they wanted to plan a boycott of the bus system. They didn't want to use her case as sort of like the rally point because she was darker skinned, she didn't have good hair, and then by December she had found out she was pregnant. So they didn't think that white people or even black people would get behind this particular girl. They wanted someone who was lighter skinned, older, someone who white people would see as sympathetic, and someone who black people would see as sort of like an icon and a leader. So Rosa Parks, who was a secretary for the NAACP in Montgomery, volunteered. And she had been arrested before, so they knew it would be easy to get her arrested. So she intentionally got herself arrested that night. They, while she was, getting booked, they were distributing all the information they had planned about the boycott. And the boycott lasted for over a year. By the time it ends, they were able to get a new Supreme Court case passed, or I guess you would say decided on or heard, at the push of the NAACP, and that case was Browder v. Gale. And in the case Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court decided that city buses needed to desegregate. So the boycott was a success. A lot of people attributed the nonviolence and the unity of the movement because people really held strong every day, refusing to get on the bus. And it took a lot of coordination from a lot of different groups. But this is really going to launch the career of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had been a leader in that boycott. He hadn't even been living in Montgomery long. He was from Atlanta. But when he was living in Montgomery, they made him one of the leaders of the boycott, and this inspired him to found his own organization in 1957 called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is like one of the big 4 major civil rights groups that we're going to see in the civil rights movement. That same year that he founds the SCLC, Little Rock, Arkansas is told they need to integrate their schools. So in 1957, so they decide that school year that they will start with Central High School, which was a white high school. They choose 9 students to attend, and the day that all these kids show up to go to school, there were mobs outside stopping them from getting in. And even more than that, the governor of Arkansas, whose name was Orville Faubus, Faubus, he had actually dispatched the Arkansas National Guard to prevent these students from entering into the school. One of the girls, whose name was Elizabeth Eckford, this is her in the sunglasses here in the front of this photograph. She actually got separated. She didn't get the call that everyone was going to walk to school together. So when she got there, she was attacked alone by this angry white screaming mob and sort of like shut down. But luckily there was a woman in the crowd who was able to get her out and get her home. And you can see the National Guardsmen in the background not doing anything to protect her, not doing anything to help her, because what they were there to do and what they were ordered to do was make sure that the kids didn't get into school. So we go through weeks and weeks of back and forth between 2 groups. The local government of Arkansas, the governor, who was refusing to allow the students to attend and to integrate, and then the president, the office of the presidency, President Eisenhower, who was very much, he's not necessarily a supporter of civil rights, but he was a hardcore supporter of his job and enforcing the law, which was his job. And now that the Supreme Court is saying integrate schools, Eisenhower's perspective was, okay, we need to integrate schools immediately. You don't get to say no. Like, that's what the federal government's saying. So the states have to do it. That's what the Constitution says. So after a lot of back and forth, and a lot, day after day of these mobs growing, riots breaking out, finally, Eisenhower left vacation. He was actually on vacation while all this was going on, trying to handle it from there. He ended up leaving vacation early, going back to D.C., giving a televised address where he announced that he would be sending federal troops to escort the children into school and make sure they got in. They finally did. So it was a success. They were able to integrate the school. But that was really just the beginning. All year long, these non-Black students had to be a very exposed and vulnerable minority in this aggressive school population. They were attacked, abused verbally and physically through the entire school year. They had to keep the federal troops there all year long. So just because they got in the front door finally didn't mean that this was over. That was just sort of like the I guess breaking ground on the next big thing to happen. This is a photograph of the Little Rock Nine. I think it was 50 years later. It could be longer. Standing in front of Central High School, which, fun fact, is now a primarily Black school in Little Rock. So the last, I guess you would say, major moment of these early years of the civil rights movement and these integration protests is the Greensboro Four. We know very well, so I shouldn't have to get into too much detail here, but February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American male students from A&T went to the Woolworths. Y'all know where it is downtown. They've still got the sign up, but now it's the museum. But they went to the Woolworths, which was about to close, sat down at the lunch counter where they weren't allowed to protest, but it didn't really get a lot of traction that night because, like I said, it didn't last long. They were already about to close. But the next day, these 4 freshmen came back and sat down at the lunch counter again, and they did this every day. And more, day after day, more and more students came, not just from A&T, but from Bennett, from UNCG, from Guilford College, from Greensboro College, and it attracted tons of media attention. People were going in there and attacking them, and they were remaining calm and just focusing on the sit-in and the movement to try to get Woolworths, and not only Woolworths, but the other businesses in downtown Greensboro to agree to integrate. After several months of protests, even into the summer protests that were led by Dudley High School students, once the college students had gone home after the end of the school year, the protests continued. They kept meeting with the business, with city council and business leaders of downtown, and they finally agreed to desegregate downtown Greensboro. So this really showed how powerful this younger generation could be in this movement. A lot of what we see, like in the Montgomery bus boycott, that was definitely led by older people. Martin Luther King and E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson and the leaders of that movement, they weren't old, but they were older. These are college students, and the Dudley students were teenagers who managed to find their place in the movement and secure real change. So that's going to inspire our 4th civil rights group to form, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was founded by a woman named Ella Baker, who was at a nonviolence training at Shaw University, which is HBCU in Raleigh. After the Greensboro 4 situation had happened, she was there for this training and thought, we need a place and a way for students to get involved and create this grassroots movement in their communities to secure social change. And that's exactly what SNCC was designed to do. She's, like I said, Ella Baker, one of the founders, and SNCC, the SCLC, the NAACP, and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, founded during World War II. Those are going to be the 4 leading groups as we move forward into the civil rights movement.